Welcome in, everybody. Today we're diving into Know What Matters.
By Ron Shaich.
Yes, thank you. Ron Shaich, the founder of Panera Bread. And
Founder and
yeah,
I think he was CEO for quite some time as well.
oh, for sure. Yeah. He's got a long history with the company.
Yeah.
But this book, it's not just like a straight up business book. It's part memoir, part, you know,
Kind of like a strategy guide.
yeah, strategy guides,
Yeah.
which is cool because we get like the behind the scenes stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that makes the book really interesting is he is just so candid about, the challenges he faced, like the things that didn't go well and the lessons he learned along the way. He doesn't shy away from, the tough stuff.
Yeah. And I think that's so helpful for us because we can learn, not just about the successes, but about the failures too.
Mm.
And he starts off right away with this idea. It's a decision-making tool that I hadn't heard of before called the pre-mortem.
Yeah. It's really fascinating.
So what is it?
So the idea is you envision your future self, right? And you ask yourself, what do I need to do now of it to feel proud of my life later?
Oh, so it's like working backward from your ideal future.
Yeah.
Okay. I can see how that would be really powerful because then you're making choices now based on where you want to end up.
Exactly. And it forces you to think long term, to really consider the consequences of your actions. And Sheikh applied this future back thinking to his business decisions as well, which I think is really interesting.
Which is impressive because he starts with like the most basic of businesses, like a student-run convenience store in college.
Right.
Right?
And what's interesting about that too is that like he wasn't just like, I need to start a business. Like there was a problem that he saw.
Okay.
Right. So the campus store at the time was just like overcharging students and kind of like disrespecting them.
Mm-hmm.
And so he and his friends were like, well, why don't we just create a better option?
Oh, that's a good point. It was meeting a need.
Yeah, it was meeting a need, solving a problem.
Classic entrepreneur, right?
Classic entrepreneur. And then, so he kind of gets that entrepreneurial bug, right? Starts a cookie store called the Cookie Jar.
Mm-hmm.
And then eventually he acquires Au Bon Pain.
Right. Which, for people who aren't familiar, is a French bakery.
Yeah, it was like very traditional, French bakery.
Okay.
But he kind of had this vision to transform it into more of a good food served quickly concept.
And was that where the bakery cafe idea was born? Like this, because Panera is obviously known for that.
It was a really pivotal moment. I think, like, the story goes that he saw a customer, like, literally making a sandwich with Au Bon Pain's bread.
Okay.
And it was like, wait a minute, people are craving something more than just pastries.
That's insightful. Like, they're not coming to him and saying, hey, we want sandwiches too. But just by observing.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a good point. So then he takes Au Bon Pain public, right?
Yeah.
And you'd think that would be like this celebratory moment.
Yeah, you would think.
Like, we made it.
Pop the champagne.
Yeah. But he talks about being really conflicted about that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So why was that?
Yeah, I think on the one hand, he was super excited about the possibilities, the access to capital, being able to grow the company. But he was also really worried about losing control, like, of his vision.
Okay.
Because, when you go public, suddenly you have all these shareholders, you have all these people who have a say in what you do.
They're prioritizing profit over everything else, probably.
Right. And he was really concerned about that short-term pressure versus, like, his long-term vision for the company.
I mean, it's a tough decision for any founder. How do you balance those competing desires?
It is. It's that classic dilemma of, do you stay small and in control, or do you go big and potentially lose some of that control?
So how did he end up making that decision? Like, what tipped the scales?
I think he went back to his future back, thinking, asking himself, what will allow me to build the kind of company I envision for the future? And for him, at that time, going public was the best path forward, even with its inherent risks.
Interesting. So even though Au Bon Pain was doing really well, like the bakery cafe thing was taking off, he was already kind of looking ahead, like what's next? Because he talks about like competitive advantage is you're always having to evolve.
Always. You can't just rest on your laurels.
Yeah.
And he was really good at observing trends and kind of anticipating what was coming next.
And that brings us to the birth of Panera, right? So he saw this trend that he calls the drive for specialness. What did he mean by that?
So it was this idea that consumers were kind of shifting away from like mass-produced brands, the same thing for everyone.
Yeah.
And they were starting to seek out more unique, high-quality experiences in all these different categories, from beer to coffee to, even bread.
Okay, so it wasn't just about the product itself. It
Yeah.
was about the feeling.
Yeah, it was about feeling special, feeling like you were getting something unique, something that was tailored to you. And Shaich, along with his colleague, Dwight Jewson, had this aha moment where they realized that this trend was about to hit food in a big way. Like, people didn't just want a special product.
They wanted to feel special in the way they were dining.
Exactly. Like, the whole experience needed to feel elevated.
So that's a really big insight, and that's what led to Panera. But, getting from that aha moment to, like, a nationwide chain of bakery cafes.
It's a long road.
It's a big jump.
Yeah.
So he talks about, like, this concept essence document, right?
Yeah.
Which I'm curious about, because it wasn't just a vision, it was like a blueprint, right?
It was a blueprint. It was incredibly detailed. Like, he spent 9 months perfecting this document. Like, everything from the menu and the design to the customer experience, it was all laid out in this document.
That's a level of detail that I think a lot of people wouldn't even think about.
And it shows how much he valued, like, clarity and precision in building a successful business. He wasn't just winging it. He had a plan.
Yeah.
A very, very detailed plan.
That's impressive.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that, that level of detail really shaped how Panera grew.
For sure.
Yeah. So we'll get into that in the next part of our deep dive. We'll explore how, all of that planning and that concept essence really guided Panera's expansion.
Yeah. And we'll talk about some of the challenges they faced along the way.
Because it wasn't all smooth sailing. Right.
It never is.
Right. So stay tuned. We'll be back with part 2.
So you mentioned the concept essence document and how that really guided Panera's expansion. And one of the things that Shaich talks about is this idea of, like, feeding the growth monster, but not compromising the values.
Right. Because I would think that's, as you grow, it gets harder and harder
to maintain
keep those values in check.
Yeah.
So how did he do it?
So, obviously they needed to find ways to increase sales per cafe. And, one of the things that they did that was really smart was expanding into breakfast.
Oh, yeah?
And catering.
Makes sense, because they're already known for their baked goods.
Right.
And sandwiches. So, like, why not just, serve them all day?
Exactly. Leverage those existing strengths and appeal to a wider range of customers.
And were there any, like, missteps along the way? Like, I seem to recall that they tried to do pizza at some point.
Yes. Crispani, yeah, that was not a success.
What happened?
Well, I think, they got a little bit caught up in the excitement of a new product, and they kind of built up too much hype before they were really ready.
Okay.
And, I think part of it was just that, like, people didn't necessarily see Panera as a pizza place.
Right.
It was a bakery cafe.
Yeah, you go there for soup and salad and sandwiches.
Right. And I think, they kind of underestimated the challenge of changing people's perceptions of the brand.
Oh, so it's like, even if it's good pizza, it's like, that's not what we...
It's not what you think of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think they also learned a really valuable lesson about managing expectations. Under promise, over deliver.
That's always a good rule of thumb.
Yeah. So, I mean, even the best entrepreneurs make mistakes, right?
Absolutely.
It's all part of the learning process. But then, you mentioned as they were growing, like, they had this really big operational hurdle to overcome, which was that 1 in 7 orders was messed up.
Yeah. It's a crazy statistic.
It's a lot.
And Shaich attributes this to a lack of what he calls operational integrity.
So what does that mean exactly?
It's basically the ability to consistently deliver what the customer orders and pays for.
Okay, so the basics.
The basic.
Of getting the order right.
But, when you're operating at scale, it's not as easy as it sounds. And, he realized that they needed to make some big changes to their systems and processes to improve their accuracy.
So what did he do? Like, how do you even begin to tackle a problem like that?
So he's a big believer in learning from the best. So he started researching companies that were known for their operational excellence.
Okay.
Companies that just had, like, really dialed in systems. And he found inspiration in a small barbecue chain that was achieving, like, near perfect order accuracy, like almost no messed up orders.
Wow. What was their secret? Like, how are they doing that?
So their system was, like, designed for simplicity and efficiency. Clear roles and responsibilities, visual cues, checks and balances at every step. It was like a well-oiled machine.
So it's not just about having, like, the right people.
No,
it's about having the right systems in place. Yeah, that makes sense.
And Shaich realized that, like, Panera needed to kind of have that same level of rigor in their operations if they wanted to achieve that kind of consistency.
And this is all happening as technology is, like, changing the restaurant industry.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Like, it's the early 2010s.
Yep. Huh.
Mobile ordering is becoming a thing.
Yeah. And Shaich, he saw how clunky and frustrating the ordering process was becoming, especially with mobile devices.
Yeah.
And he even talks about, like, having this really frustrating experience trying to order his own go-to sandwich online.
Oh, so he felt the pain firsthand.
He felt it.
Yeah.
And that was kind of a wake-up call.
Yeah.
And it led to the development of what they called Panera 2.0.
Which was
basically their initiative to embrace digital ordering and kind of, like, transform the customer experience.
So it wasn't just about adding an online ordering system.
Yeah.
It was about rethinking, like, the whole process.
Yeah, they had to completely revamp their production systems to handle the increased volume, complexity of digital orders.
So they had to, like, almost rebuild the back end of the business to make this work.
Yeah, it was a huge undertaking.
Yeah. And I mean, that's a really good example of, like, connecting the dots between strategy, technology, operations, right? Like,
absolutely.
You can't just focus on one piece.
Right.
You have to think about how it all fits together.
Yeah. And I think Shaich was really good at that, like, seeing the big picture.
And while all of that's happening, he's also thinking about, like, future growth opportunity.
Right. Always looking ahead.
Always looking ahead.
Yeah. So he started exploring, concepts like large order delivery for catering, small order delivery, and even, like, Panera at Home, which was like a line of Panera branded products that you could buy at the grocery store.
Okay.
So he was really thinking beyond, like, the traditional restaurant experience.
Yeah, it's almost like he was building a food platform.
Yeah.
As opposed to just a chain of restaurants.
Exactly.
But all of this innovation, all this growth, I mean, it came at a cost.
I did.
Like, personally for him.
Yeah.
And he's very candid about that in the book.
Very candid. Talks about, the long hours, the missed family dinners, the strain on his relationships.
Right.
It took a toll.
Yeah. I mean, I can only imagine, like, the pressure of running a public company and going through all of these transformations. Like, it's got to be tough. But he kept pushing forward, right? Like, he had this vision and...
He did. And he talks about, the CEO as kind of like a parish priest.
Okay. I remember reading that. I wasn't quite sure what he meant by that.
So it was this idea that, like, his role was more than just, the CEO.
Right.
He was a storyteller. He was a guide, someone who helped people connect to, like, a larger purpose.
Oh, that's interesting.
So it's about providing context, meaning inspiration.
Yeah, so it's almost like creating, like, a sense of community within the company, like a shared set of values that everyone can kind of rally around.
Exactly. And I think that's so crucial, especially in a large organization where it's easy for people to feel disconnected from the overall mission.
Right. So we've seen how he led Panera through, rapid growth, technological transformation, personal challenges. But then there was some even bigger challenges that came later, right?
Yeah.
Like, he had to deal with activist investors, the changing food landscape, and ultimately the decision to sell the company. So those are all things that we're going to explore in the final part of our deep dive.
Well, we'll see how he navigated those later challenges and, how his vision for Panera ultimately shaped the future of the company.
So we left off talking about some of the later challenges Shaich faced. And you mentioned the activist investors. Like, is that just something that every CEO has to kind of deal with?
I mean, it seems to be pretty common, especially for public companies.
Yeah.
They're always looking for ways to squeeze more profit out of the business.
And Shaich really seems to have, like, struggled with that.
Yeah.
He talks about, like, wishing he had more control to fend them off and really stay true to his vision.
It was a source of a lot of frustration for him because, the activist investors they're very focused on the short term.
Yeah.
Right? Like, what can we do to boost the stock price right now?
Yeah.
Whereas Shaich was always thinking about the long-term health of the company.
Right.
So it was a constant battle between those two approaches.
So how did he deal with it? I mean, did he just have to, like, give in to their demands?
I think he learned to to pick his battles.
Yeah.
He would compromise on certain points, but he held firm on the things that he felt were really essential to the long-term success of Panera.
So, kind of finding that balance between
Yeah.
keeping the investors happy, but also staying true to his vision.
Exactly. And around the same time, he also made this really big decision to commit Panera to clean food.
Right. So what was driving that? Was it just like a trend that he was seeing in the food industry, or was it something more than that?
I think it was definitely more than that. Like he saw that consumers were becoming more and more aware
Yeah.
of the importance of, healthy, sustainable food.
Right.
And he knew that Panera needed to adapt to meet those changing needs. But I think it was also like a personal thing for him. Like
Right.
he really believed in it. He felt this responsibility to make Panera a force for good in the food industry.
So it wasn't just about like profits. It was
Yeah.
about something bigger than that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he made like a public commitment
He did.
to remove all artificial additives from the menu by 2016,
That's right.
which is huge, like reformulating all of those recipes.
Yeah. And retraining staff and like all of that.
Yeah, that's a big undertaking.
It was, and it wasn't, without its challenges.
Right.
Some
Well.
key members of his team actually didn't agree with this new direction
Okay.
and ended up leaving the company.
So it's like even when you're making like what you think is a positive change,
Yeah.
you're not always going to have everyone on board.
Right. It can be hard to get people to buy into a new vision.
Yeah, yeah. But it seemed to like really resonate with customers.
It did.
Right, like it set them apart in the industry.
Yeah. It wasn't just talk. They were actually doing it.
Right, right.
And I think that built a lot of trust with their customers.
Yeah. And then, after all of that, he made the decision to sell Panera,
Yeah.
which, I mean, that must have been a really tough call after so many years building the company.
He was. He talks about it in the book, like wrestling with that decision. The emotional weight of letting go of something that he had poured so much of himself into.
Yeah, yeah.
So, it wasn't an easy decision.
So what were like his main concerns? Was it about, profit or finding the right buyer? Like what were his biggest worries?
I think it was more about finding the right buyer. Someone who would really take care of the company
Yeah.
and its people. He wanted to make sure that Panera's legacy
Yeah.
would be in good hands.
And he had a few different offers, right? Like I remember reading that there was like talk of a merger with Starbucks at some point.
That's right.
But ultimately he chose to sell to JSB Holding Company.
Yeah, in 2017.
And why them?
He felt like they were just the best fit for Panera's culture and values.
So it sounds like he really prioritized like the well-being of the company.
Yeah.
And the employees.
Over maybe a bigger payout.
Yeah, yeah. Interesting. Well, I think looking back on Sheikh's journey, what are some of the key takeaways that you think, our listeners should really hold on to?
I think his concept of future back thinking is so powerful. Envisioning your ideal future and then working backward to figure out how to get there.
Yeah.
It really forces you to make choices that are aligned with your long-term goals.
And I think we can apply that to, not just our careers,
Absolutely.
but our personal lives as well.
Think about where you want to be in 5, 10, 20 years.
Right.
And then make decisions today that are going to help you get there.
I like that.
I think another big takeaway is just the importance of constantly seeking a competitive advantage. Asking yourself, what are we doing that others aren't? How can we be better? How can we be different?
It's about like never settling.
Yeah.
Always pushing yourself.
To be better.
Yeah. And lastly, I think Sheikh's story really highlights the human side of business. It's not just about numbers and profits.
It's about people.
Yeah.
It's about building relationships.
Yeah.
Inspiring others.
Yeah.
Creating a culture where people feel valued and respected.
Yeah, yeah. And that's what ultimately creates a lasting impact. Well, that's some really great food for thought. Pun intended, I guess.
I had to.
You had to.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for diving into this book with me. This was great.
My pleasure. I always enjoy talking about, entrepreneurs who are really trying to make a difference.
Yeah, yeah. And for our listeners, think about this. How can you apply that future back thinking to your own life? What steps can you take today to create a future that you'll be proud of tomorrow? What really matters to you? And are your choices reflecting those values? Hopefully this deep dive into Ron Sheikh's journey has given you some tools to start answering those questions for yourself. Thanks for listening.